The first thing I registered was the brutal cold of the concrete pressing against my cheek. The world had dissolved into a sickening, spinning gray blur, my own breath shallow and distant in my ears. Then, suddenly, there was heat, a shocking, specific pressure against my mouth, lips, soft, firm, and terrifyingly real. It wasn't a medical check, it was a collision. In that single, silent second, the professional glass wall I had built between us didn't just crack, it shattered. But to understand the weight of that kiss, you have to understand the silence that came before. My studio was a cavernous industrial space in the Navy Yard, a place where the air always hung heavy with the sharp experimentation of turpentine and the dry, ancient smell of dust. It was a cathedral for my obsessions. For 3 months, I had lived inside these brick walls, fueled by espresso and a terror I refused to name. The gallery show was 2 weeks away. The comeback, my agent called it. The final verdict, my anxiety whispered. I was vibrating with it. A tuning fork struck too hard, humming with a frequency that threatened to snap bone. And in the center of this chaotic, paint-splattered storm sat Eliza. She was the only still point in my universe. Perched on the raised platform, draped in a sheet of heavy emerald velvet that pooled around her hips, she looked less like a hired model and more like a queen, waiting for an execution she knew she would survive. We had worked together for 6 months, and in that time, we had exchanged perhaps 50 words per session. Our relationship was defined by a rigorous professional geometry. I stood on one side of the easel, frantic and demanding. She sat on the other, absolute and unflinching. I knew the topography of her body better than I knew the lines of my own hands. I knew how the light caught the ridge of her collarbone when she inhaled. I knew the precise, heavy texture of her hair when it slipped from her shoulder. But I knew nothing of her voice. Keep your chin up. Turn 3 degrees to the left. Hold. Those were the only prayers I recited, and she answered them with a silent, devastating compliance. She wasn't just a body to be captured. She was a force to be reckoned with, a gravity well that pulled at the edges of my sanity. Most models check their phones during breaks, they stretch, they complain about the draft. Eliza never complained. She existed in a state of suspended animation, her presence so potent that even when I turned my back to mix a color, I could feel the weight of her gaze on my spine. The distance between us was necessary. It was the lens through which I saw her. If I acknowledged the heat that rose in the room when the afternoon sun hit the floorboards, if I acknowledged that my hands shook not just from caffeine, but from the sheer proximity of her skin, the work would fail. So I starved the feeling. I starved myself, too. My hands were stained with Prussian blue and exhaustion. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days, convinced that hunger sharpened my vision. It was a dangerous arrogance. Hunger doesn't sharpen, it hollows. I was painting the curve of her neck, a difficult, shadowy transition that refused to resolve. I attacked the canvas, scraping pigment away, layering it back on, my breathing ragged. The studio was silent, save for the wet slap of the brush and the distant hum of the city traffic. Eliza didn't move. She didn't blink. She just watched me with those dark, unreadable eyes, witnessing my slow unraveling with a patience that felt almost like a judgment. The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning from atmosphere into something viscous. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead and leaving a smear of cadmium red across my temple, like a wound. I stepped back to assess the proportions, and the floor seemed to tilt, just a fraction, a warning shot. I ignored it. I always ignored the body's warnings. I treated my physical form like a rental car I intended to return with the tank empty. But the tank was already dry. The focus I prided myself on, that laser-like intensity that had won me awards and cost me marriages, began to fracture. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged, heavy, waiting for the spark that would burn the whole structure down. It didn't begin with fear. That is the great lie about panic, that it announces itself with a scream. It doesn't. It begins with a loss of precision, a sudden, terrifying clumsiness that feels like a glitch in the software of your own body. I was attempting to lay down a glaze of transparent oxide red along the shadow of her jawline. It was a stroke I had executed 1,000 times, a movement that should have been as automatic as breathing. I held the breath in my lungs, steadying my core, narrowing my eyes to filter the light. My brain sent the signal to my hand, move, but the signal got lost in the static. My hand, usually a steady instrument of my will, jerked. It was a violent, involuntary spasm, a rebellion of the nerves. The brush skidded across the canvas, leaving a jagged, ugly scar of red paint slashing through the delicate skin tone I had spent 3 hours perfecting. I stared at the ruin, my mind unable to comprehend the disconnect between intention and action. My fingers went numb, the sensation draining out of them like water from a cracked vase. The brush slipped from my grip. It hit the floor with a clatter that sounded impossibly loud in the vaulted silence. The wooden handle bounced once, twice, before rolling to a stop against the leg of the easel, leaving a trail of red pigment on the concrete like a crime scene. On the platform, the statue breathed. Eliza broke her pose. It was a micro-movement, a shift of her weight forward, her bare foot twitching against the velvet. Her eyes, usually fixed on a point above my left shoulder, snapped to mine. I saw the flash of concern there, the human instinct to help, to ask, to reach out. "Don't move," I barked the command before I could stop myself. My voice was thin, brittle, cracking like dry parchment. It was cruelty born of humiliation. I couldn't bear for her to see the tremor that was now traveling up my forearm, seizing my bicep. Eliza froze instantly, retreating back into the safety of her stillness. But the damage was done. The air between us was no longer empty. It was vibrating with my failure. I turned away, pretending to search for a rag, my hands fumbling over the chaotic landscape of my pallet table. It's just low blood sugar, I told myself, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. You haven't eaten since Tuesday. It's just the caffeine. It's just the stress. I tried to catalog the symptoms, to organize them into a diagnosis that I could control. If it was biological, I could fix it. I could drink juice. I could sit down. I could master this. But the denial was a paper shield against a hurricane. The studio began to warp. The high windows, usually sources of consistent northern light, seemed to stretch and elongate. The dust motes dancing in the sunbeams weren't floating anymore. They were swarming. My peripheral vision grayed out, tunneling my focus down to the single, terrifying point of the dropped brush on the floor. The air turned thick, gelatinous. Inhaling required a conscious, muscular effort, as if I were trying to breathe underwater. My heart, previously a distant rhythm, suddenly slammed against my ribs, a trapped bird battering itself against the cage. It wasn't a fast beat. It was a hard, erratic thudding that shook my entire frame. Thump, thump, stop, thump. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white, trying to anchor myself to the physical world. I am Vivian. I am in my studio. I am painting. But the words dissolved before they could form a thought. The floor tilted, just a degree, then 2. Gravity, once a constant, had become a variable I could no longer solve. The heat in the room spiked, a sudden suffocating wave. Sweat pricked at my hairline, cold and oily. I looked back at Eliza, desperate for a focal point, but she was blurring at the edges, dissolving into a smear of green velvet and pale skin. I looked back at the canvas. That red scar I'd inflicted on her jawline wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a verdict. In that blurring, underwater light, the entire painting suddenly looked grotesque, a caricature of desire rather than art. I had spent months trying to capture her silence, and I had only captured my own noise. I reached for the palette knife, a desperate, irrational need to scrape it all away, to erase the evidence of my incompetence before she could see it. My fingers closed around the cold metal handle. I commanded my arm to lift. "Fix it," I screamed silently. "Just fix it." But the command dissolved in the synapse. My knees, which had supported me through 12-hour sessions and sleepless nights, simply resigned. There was no warning wobble, no graceful slide. It was a structural collapse. The strings were cut. I felt the strange, weightless sensation of my center of gravity dropping out, followed immediately by the sickening lurch of the floor rushing up to meet me. The humiliation was sharper than the fear. I was Vivian, the artist who controlled the light, the form, the very atmosphere of the room. And now I was nothing more than a failing body obeying the laws of physics. I didn't fall like a heroine in a Victorian novel. I fell like a sack of wet clay, heavy and uncoordinated. I tried to catch myself, but my hands were useless, numb things. I grabbed at the air and found only the edge of the rolling pallet table. It didn't hold me. I took it with me. The crash was apocalyptic. Glass jars of medium shattered against the concrete, sending the sharp chemical smell of linseed oil and Damar varnish exploding into the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fear. Turpentine splashed across the floorboards, dissolving years of dried pigment. Brushes scattered like pickup sticks. The heavy wooden easel shuddered, groaning under the impact, before tipping dangerously. The noise was a physical blow, a chaotic clamor of metal and wood that echoed off the high brick walls, mocking the sacred, church-like silence I had enforced for months. Through the haze, through the tunnel of gray static that was rapidly closing in on my vision, I saw the impossible. The statue moved. Eliza, who had held that pose for 40 minutes without a tremor, shattered her own stillness. The green velvet sheet slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the platform like a discarded skin as she launched herself off the dais. She ignored the sharp debris, ignored the wet paint. She wasn't the muse anymore. She wasn't the passive object of my gaze. She was a blur of motion, terrifyingly fast, rushing toward me across the paint-splattered floor. Her bare feet slapped against the dirty concrete, a sound that felt wrong, violative of the distance I had kept between us. Her face, usually a mask of serene indifference, was twisted into something raw and unrecognizable. I wanted to tell her to stop. I wanted to order her back to the platform, to reestablish the boundary, to fix the composition. You're out of the light, I thought, the absurdity of the critique floating through my disintegrating mind. You're ruining the pose. But my mouth wouldn't form the words. The gray static turned to black, swallowing the studio, the painting, and the rushing figure of the woman I had obsessed over. The floor was hard against my shoulder, then the cold seeped in, and finally, there was nothing. The terrified, controlling part of my brain that demanded perfection finally went dark, surrendering to the gravity it had fought for so long. It was the ultimate failure, and in that last microsecond of consciousness, it felt like dying. Consciousness returned not as a light, but as a sensation. I didn't wake up to the sharp sting of a slap on the cheek or the shock of cold water splashed against my face. I woke up to pressure. I woke up to a seal being formed against the cold reality of the floor, a specific, focused heat that was dragging me back from the edge of the void. It was a kiss, but to call it a kiss implies romance, and this was something far more primal. It was a resuscitation of the spirit. It was the desperate, terrifying act of an anchor being thrown into a storm. My eyes were still too heavy to open, but my other senses were firing with painful, high-definition clarity. I felt the hard concrete biting into my shoulder blades, the smell of spilled turpentine burning in my nose, and overriding it all, the shocking, undeniable pressure of her mouth on mine. It wasn't tentative. There was no hesitation, no shy testing of the waters. It was firm, absolute, and commanding. She wasn't asking for permission. She was forcing air back into a room that had run out of it. I realized, through the haze of my own panic, that she was grounding me. My heart was still thrashing against my ribs, a chaotic staccato rhythm that threatened to crack the bone. But the steady pressure of her lips was a counterweight. It was a physical demand to stop, to stay, to be here. It was the most intimate contact I had ever experienced, not because of the physical act, but because of the terrifying vulnerability of it. I was the artist, the observer, the one who held the brush and the power. And here I was, flat on my back in the ruins of my own ego, being kept alive by the woman I had treated as a piece of furniture for 6 months. The sensory details flooded in, overwhelming the gray static. I smelled her properly for the first time. Not the acrid dust of the studio, but the scent of her skin. Clean, cool, smelling faintly of unscented soap and the damp, metallic tang of the rain that had been threatening all morning. I felt the weight of her hair. It had fallen forward, creating a curtain that shut out the harsh studio lights, a private, dark tent where only the two of us existed. The strands brushed against my cheek, soft and heavy, a stark contrast to the brutal hardness of the floor. Then, my eyes snapped open. For a single suspended second, our faces were inches apart. I saw the pores of her skin, the dark, dilated pupils of her eyes, the flush of adrenaline high on her cheekbones. I saw the terrifying reality of her. And then, she was gone. The moment my gaze focused, Eliza pulled back. She didn't scramble away in a panic. She didn't gasp or cover her mouth in shame. She simply withdrew, sitting back on her heels with a fluid, controlled grace. She severed the connection as surgically as if she had cut a cord. There was no apology in her face. There was no embarrassment. She just watched me. Her chest was heaving slightly, the only sign that she had just broken every rule in the unwritten contract between us. She looked at me with an intensity that stripped me bare, her eyes tracking the return of color to my face, the steadying of my breath. The silence that rushed in to fill the space between us was deafening, heavier than the crash of the easel, charged with the electricity of what had just happened and would never be spoken of. The hierarchy of the room dissolved. That carefully maintained architecture of artist and muse, the sacred distance I had enforced with the rigor of a religion, had collapsed along with my body. Eliza stood up. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't flutter or panic. She moved with a terrifying, efficient economy, stepping over the shattered glass and the pool of turpentine as if they were merely abstract compositional elements she had decided to ignore. I watched her through half-lidded eyes. She walked to the utility sink in the corner, the sound of her bare feet on the concrete the only noise in the cavernous room. I tried to push myself up on my elbows, a desperate attempt to reassemble my dignity. My arms shook violently, useless tremors that humiliated me more than the fall itself. "I'm fine," I managed to croak out. The lie was so thin it was transparent, a pathetic scrap of pride. "I just slipped. I need to get up." Eliza didn't even turn around. The faucet squeaked on, water rushing into the metal basin. She was wringing out a cloth, one of my linen rags, usually reserved for cleaning expensive sable brushes. She returned to me, not with the deferential shuffle of a model returning to a pose, but with the stride of someone who owned the building. She knelt beside me, the movement fluid and sharp. "Lie back," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. "Eliza, I tried to leverage myself up again, panic flaring at the loss of control. I needed to stand. I needed to be the one looking down." Her hand landed on my shoulder. It was heavy, warm, and implacable. She didn't shove. She simply applied a precise, unyielding pressure that pinned me to the floor more effectively than any shackle. I froze. I had spent months directing her body. Tilt your head, arch your back, freeze. And now, with a single touch, she had completely immobilized mine. The strength in her arm was shocking. I had forgotten that holding a pose for hours requires a core of steel. I had mistaken her stillness for passivity. "Stop," she commanded. Her voice was low, stripped of any hesitation. She pressed the cold, damp linen against my forehead. The shock of it made me gasp, a sharp inhalation that finally filled my starving lungs. She wiped the sweat and paint from my temple with a roughness that felt like mercy. Then she held a mug of water to my lips. My own coffee mug, rinsed out. "Drink." I drank. I had no choice. She tipped the mug with a steady hand, watching my throat work. The water was cold, tasting faintly of old paint, but it was the best thing I had ever tasted. I looked up at her from this new, inferior angle. She had pulled on her silk robe, but it hung loose, framing the collarbones I had been painting just minutes ago. But she didn't look like art anymore. She looked like authority. This was the violation I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the kiss. It was this. Being seen. For months, I had hidden behind the easel, using the canvas as a shield to observe her without being observed in return. I was the eye, she was the object. Now, the lens was reversed. She was seeing the shaking hands, the gray skin, the pathetic, hollowed-out reality of the genius artist. She was seeing the woman who couldn't even stand up. "Sit up, slowly," she ordered, her hand moving to support my back. I obeyed. The The room spun, then settled. She didn't let go. Her arm remained a solid bar of heat against my spine, grounding me. "You're done," she stated, her eyes scanning my face with a clinical, terrifying precision. "The light," I whispered, a weak protest. "I need the light." "The light isn't going anywhere," she said, her gaze holding mine, unflinching. "But you are. We're leaving." And for the first time in my life, I didn't argue. I just let her pull me to my feet. She didn't ask for the keys. She simply held out her hand. A week ago, the mere suggestion would have been laughable. I was Vivian. I drove like I painted, fast, aggressive, trusting only my own reflexes. But my hand was still trembling, a persistent, humiliating vibration. I dropped the keys into her palm. The metal clicked against her skin, heavy and final. We ran to the car under the assault of the storm. The rain wasn't a drizzle. It was a curtain, cold and violent, soaking through my silk shirt in seconds. But inside was a capsule. The heavy thud of the door closing sealed us in. The sudden silence was jarring, broken only by the rhythmic thwack hiss of the wipers fighting the deluge. I sat in the passenger seat, a space I hadn't occupied in years. It felt foreign. I felt small. The leather was cold, but the vents blasted hot air that smelled of dust and engine warmth. I watched the city dissolve through the glass. New York in the rain is a watercolor painting left out in a storm, everything bleeding into gray. The traffic lights smeared into long vertical lines of red and amber. The world outside was chaos, but inside this steel box, the air was still, pressurized with the memory of her mouth on mine. I looked at her, not as a problem of light and shadow to be solved, but as a woman driving my car through a monsoon. Her profile was cut sharp against the sliding gray light. She was focused, her eyes narrowing slightly at the glare of oncoming headlights, her jaw set with a determination I had never seen on the platform. My gaze dropped to her hands on the wheel. I had painted those hands 3 times. I knew the length of the metacarpals, the specific way the vein branched across her wrist. But I had never seen them do anything. I had never seen them grip leather with such competent strength. They were steady. While mine were tucked away to hide their shaking, hers were firm, making micro-adjustments as the car hydroplaned over a puddle. She corrected the skid without a flinch. It hit me then, a realization so sharp it felt like a physical blow. I didn't know her. I had spent hundreds of hours staring at her naked skin, obsessing over the architecture of her face, and I knew nothing about who she was. I didn't know she drove with this confident aggression. I didn't know she smelled like rain, even when she was dry. I didn't know that in a crisis, she took command. I had reduced her to a surface, a beautiful, silent thing. And now, that surface had cracked open, revealing the person who was the only reason I wasn't still lying on a concrete floor. The silence in the car shifted. It wasn't the professional silence of the studio. It was the heavy, companionable silence of 2 people who have survived a crash. It was intimate. The space between the seats felt charged. Every time she shifted gears, her hand brushed the air near my knee, and the proximity sent a fresh wave of heat through my damp clothes. I watched her thumb tap a silent rhythm against the wheel, a tick I had never witnessed. We turned onto the bridge, the metal girders flashing by like the ribs of a beast. Below us, the river was a black void, but here, in the sanctuary of the leather and heat, I was safe. Safe because of her. The realization was terrifying. I had built a career on control, and now my safety depended entirely on the woman I had underestimated for half a year. I closed my eyes, listening to the rain, and surrendered. The elevator doors parted with a soft, pneumatic hush, revealing the sanctuary I had spent a decade earning. My apartment was a penthouse in Tribeca, a floating glass box that looked down on the city with cold, expensive indifference. Usually, crossing this threshold felt like entering a fortress, a place where the chaos of the world and the demands of my own mind could be locked out. But tonight, with my clothes clinging damply to my skin and my hands still trembling, it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The walls were stark white, hung with art that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The furniture was Italian, low-slung and uncomfortable. Sculptural pieces designed to be looked at, not touched. It was a museum of my life, curated to project power and control and utterly devoid of warmth. And Eliza was the vandal. Seeing her standing in my foyer was a visual shock that my brain couldn't quite process. She belonged to the studio, to the realm of heightened reality, oil paint, and dramatic lighting. In that context, she was a queen. Here, against the limestone floors and the austere minimalism, she was a disruption. She brought the storm in with her. She was vibrant, messy, and terrifyingly alive in a space designed for stasis. It felt like a violation of the rigorous separation I maintained between my work and my existence. Church and state. The muse stays on the pedestal. The artist goes home to the tower. Bringing her here was crossing a line that I hadn't just drawn in the sand. I had carved it into the bedrock. She wasn't a guest. She was an invasion force of one. She didn't wait for an invitation. She didn't pause to admire the view of the Hudson or the original Cy Twombly hanging in the hall. She bypassed the grandeur with a total lack of reverence, walking past the living room as if it were merely a corridor. She headed straight for the kitchen. I trailed behind her, feeling less like the owner of the estate and more like a ghost haunting my own hallway. I watched her open the refrigerator, flinching internally. I knew what she would find: a desolate landscape of sparkling water, a jar of artisanal mustard, and a bottle of vintage champagne. A shrine to malnutrition. She didn't comment. She didn't sigh or offer a look of pity, for which I was grateful. She simply closed the heavy stainless steel door and turned to the pantry. She moved through my kitchen with the same terrifying efficiency she had shown in the studio, opening cupboards until she found a tin of tea and a kettle. She was domesticating the space. With the simple sound of water running and the click of the stove igniting, she was transforming my sterile laboratory into a place where human beings actually lived. I leaned against the doorframe, hugging my arms around my chest to stop the shivering. It wasn't just the cold damp of my clothes. It was the sheer surrealism of the domestic tableau. But beneath the quiet sounds of the kettle heating, the silence was screaming. The tension of the kiss hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the third person in the room. Every time she reached for a mug or a spoon, I saw the movement of her arm and remembered the strength of it, holding me down. The act remained unacknowledged, a massive radioactive object sitting on the counter between us. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to demand an explanation for the breach of protocol. But I couldn't. I was terrified that if I spoke, the fragile reality we were in would shatter, and I would be left alone in the cold again. Night didn't fall so much as it drowned us. The storm outside had turned the floor-to-ceiling windows into obsidian mirrors, reflecting only the ghost of the room back at us. The city was erased, the skyline swallowed by a deluge that battered the glass with a rhythmic, violent insistence. We sat on the deep pile rug because the Italian leather sofa felt too formal, too stiff, a waiting room for a life I wasn't currently living. Eliza sat cross-legged across from me, the steam from her mug drifting up to obscure her face in soft gray ribbons. The silence was no longer a void. It was a structure we were building together, brick by heavy brick. But the foundation was unstable. The memory of her mouth on mine was a heat source I couldn't ignore. It radiated from the center of the room, more potent than the storm, more grounding than the floor beneath us. I traced the rim of my ceramic cup, my finger trembling slightly less now, but the internal vibration remained, a hum of adrenaline that refused to dissipate. Why? The word slipped out before I could weigh it. It was stark, unadorned, stripping away the politeness we had been using to navigate the last hour. Eliza didn't pretend to misunderstand. She didn't ask, why what? She set her mug down on the low table with a deliberate click, the sound sharp in the quiet. She turned to me, and in the dim light of the single hallway lamp, her eyes were bottomless, stripped of the professional deference she wore in the studio. "You stopped," she said. Her voice was low, a rough velvet texture against the quiet. "You weren't just falling, Vivian. You were leaving. I saw your eyes go dark. You weren't breathing right. The air wasn't getting in. So it was medical, I said, a defensive edge sharpening my tone, trying to rebuild the walls she had demolished. A procedure, a tactic. No. The denial was instant. She shifted, closing the distance between us by mere inches, but the change in air pressure was palpable. If it were just medical, I would have slapped you. I would have shaken you awake. I would have called 911 and waited. She looked at my mouth, then back to my eyes, her gaze unflinching. I needed to anchor you, and I knew that was the only way to reach you. You don't respond to pain. You respond to intensity. The truth of it struck me silent. She had read me with a precision that was terrifying. She had seen through the bluster of the genius artist to the woman who craved a force greater than her own. I broke protocol, she added softly. You shattered it, I corrected. It was already cracking, she admitted. Do you think you're the only one who watches? Do you think I sit on that platform for 4 hours a day and see nothing? I'm the artist, I said, the words feeling hollow even as I spoke them. I'm the observer. You're the subject, she countered. At least, you are to me. I watch your hands. I watch the way you hold your breath when you're mixing a difficult color. I watch the way you destroy yourself to get the line right. She reached out then, her hand, cool and steady, wrapped around my wrist. It wasn't a romantic caress. It was a diagnostic check. Her thumb pressed against my radial artery, counting the rhythm of my blood. The contact was electric. It bypassed the brain and went straight to the nerve endings. My pulse jumped against her skin, a traitorous, frantic beat that gave away everything I had tried to hide. You've been vibrating for weeks, she murmured, her eyes dropping to watch her own hand on my wrist. I could see it from the platform. The tremor in your fingers, the way you forget to exhale. I was waiting for the snap. I just didn't know it would look like that. I thought I was hiding it, I whispered. The confession felt dangerous. A surrender of the last scrap of my control. You hide nothing, she said. You put it all on the canvas. And when you look at me, Vivian, you look at me like you're trying to consume me. And you? I asked. The air thickened, heavy with the unsaid, the tension coiling tight in the space between our bodies. I let you, she said simply. I stayed still. I let you consume. Until today. Today, you didn't have anything left to take. Her thumb continued its steady pressure, a human metronome calming the chaos in my veins. This wasn't sex. It was something far more perilous. It was intimacy without the safety net of desire. It was one human being holding the life force of another in her hand and saying, I have you. The storm raged against the glass, a chaotic symphony of wind and rain. But in the dark quiet of the room, the only sound that mattered was the steady, slowing rhythm of my heart beating against her fingertips. Morning arrived not with a burst of sun, but with a quiet, persistent gray that seeped through the floor-to-ceiling glass. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the cityscape clean and silent. I woke up on the rug, my neck stiff, a cashmere blanket, one I didn't remember retrieving, tucked carefully around my shoulders. The panic of the previous day had receded, leaving behind a strange, hollow clarity. I sat up, expecting the apartment to be empty. People usually leave when the drama subsides. They retreat to their own lives once the crisis is averted. But she was still there. Eliza was asleep on the sculptural, uncomfortable Italian sofa, her legs curled up, her head resting on a throw pillow. In the studio, under the harsh, interrogating glare of the industrial lamps, she was a construct of geometry and tension, a series of planes and angles I had to capture. Here, in the diffuse morning light, she was simply a woman. Her hair was messy, a dark tangle against the white linen. Her mouth was slightly open. One hand hung off the edge of the cushion, relaxed and open, stripped of the rigid tension she held for hours on the platform. I watched her for a long time, the silence of the apartment feeling different now. It wasn't empty, it was pregnant with presence. I realized then, with a jolt of shame, that the muse dynamic had been a lie I told myself. I hadn't kept my rigorous distance to preserve the sanctity of the art. I had kept it to preserve myself. I had used the easel as a barricade, a way to channel an obsession that terrified me into something safe, something I could control. I could touch her with a brush, I could caress her with light, but I didn't have to deal with the terrifying reality of her breathing in my space. The art wasn't the goal, it was the shield. I stood up, my body aching but functional, and went to the kitchen. The domestic ritual of grinding beans and boiling water felt grounding. When I turned back with 2 mugs, she was awake. She didn't startle or jump. She just watched me approach, her eyes sleepy but clear. "You stayed," I said, setting the mug on the low table. It wasn't a question. "You shouldn't be alone," she replied, sitting up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She took the coffee, wrapping both hands around the ceramic warmth. "Not after yesterday." "I'm usually alone," I admitted. "It's how I work. It's how I survive." "It's how you break," she corrected gently. She took a sip, her gaze over the rim steady and assessing. "Vivian, why do you do it? The starvation, the 12-hour days. You're already famous. You have the awards. What are you trying to prove?" I looked out at the gray skyline. The answer was a knot in my chest I had never untied. "But it wasn't a fluke," I whispered. "That I didn't just get lucky once. Every time I face a blank canvas, I feel like a fraud. I feel like this is the time they find out I have nothing left to say." "So you try to kill yourself to say it louder?" "I try to bleed enough to make it matter." Eliza set the mug down. "The painting doesn't need your blood," she said, her voice firm. "It needs your eyes. And you can't see anything when you're unconscious on the floor." She stood up then, the blanket falling away. She looked at me, not as the model waiting for instructions, but as a partner waiting for a decision. "We have to go back," I said, the thought terrifying me. "The show opens in 2 weeks. The painting isn't finished." "No," she agreed, "but the way you're painting it is finished." She walked past me toward the bathroom to change back into her clothes from yesterday. "We go back, but we do it differently. Or I walk." It was an ultimatum, delivered with the softness of a promise. And for the first time, I didn't want to fight for control. I wanted to follow. The smell of the studio hit me differently this time. Before, the sharp chemical mix of turpentine, linseed oil, and old dust had been the scent of my self-imposed prison. Now, walking in with Eliza's shoulder brushing against mine, it just smelled like work. We stopped at the scene of the accident. The cadmium red paint was still there on the concrete, a dried, violent splash where the brush had fallen from my numb fingers. It looked less like a mistake now, and more like a necessary demolition. It was a marker of where the old Vivian, the one who believed that great art required great suffering, had finally collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. I walked to the easel. The painting, the architecture of obsession, sat there, waiting. Technically, it was flawless. The glazing on the neck was masterful. The light was captured with mathematical precision. But it was dead. It was a painting of a ghost, rendered by a machine. It captured the distance between us perfectly, and that distance was a lie. I had spent months painting a silence that I had enforced, ignoring the loud, beating heart of the woman sitting right in front of me. I had painted the surface, but I had missed the heat. Eliza moved toward the platform, her hand reaching for the heavy green velvet sheet. It was muscle memory. She was preparing to retreat into the stillness, to become the object again, to disappear so I could work. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it stopped her instantly. She turned, holding the velvet like a shield. "You need the northern light," she reminded me, echoing my own obsession back to me. "The angle is wrong if I move." "I don't need that light," I said, putting the palette knife down. I didn't pick up the tiny sable brushes I used for agonizingly fine detail. I picked up a wider brush, one used for broad, honest strokes. "And I don't need you to be a statue. I need you to be here." "Where do you want me?" she asked, the old professional deferment slipping back into her voice. "That's not the question anymore," I replied, meeting her gaze across the dusty, sun-mote-filled air. "Where do you want to be?" Eliza paused. She looked at the uncomfortable, throne-like wooden chair on the dais, then at the floor where she had knelt over me, then at the window. She dropped the velvet sheet. It pooled on the floor, a discarded costume. She didn't climb onto the pedestal. Instead, she dragged an old, paint-splattered stool over to the window, into the direct, unmitigated sunlight. She sat down, leaning forward, elbows on her knees, her hands clasped loosely. She looked directly at me. Not past me, not through me. At me. "Here," she said. "I want to be looking at you." I turned the masterpiece to the wall. I pulled a fresh canvas, the white surface terrifying and open. But this time, I didn't freeze. I started to paint. It wasn't a battle. It was a conversation. I wasn't trying to capture her. I was trying to meet her. The strokes were looser, faster, driven not by the fear of failure, but by the urgency of the connection. I painted the strength in her shoulders, the strength that had carried me to the car. I painted the intelligence in her eyes, the mind that had diagnosed my panic before I even felt it. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the stifling vacuum of before. It was the companionable, heavy silence of two people working in tandem. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had leveled. I wasn't the director anymore. I was just the one holding the brush, documenting the fact that she was real, and that she had caught me. Control is a seductive myth we sell ourselves to keep the terror of being human at bay. But I learned the hard way that you can't paint the truth if you're too afraid to feel it. The gallery show opens next week, but the critics don't matter. As I mix this final shade of ochre, I glance over. Eliza isn't a statue. She is the gravity that keeps my feet on the ground. If you understand the weight of silent trust, subscribe for more.